welcome to the second online event for the Cumbrian White-Tailed Eagle Project Social Feasibility Study. I'm Faye Whiley. I'm the Species Recovery Social Science Officer, and I work for the Lifescape Project. So apologies, getting messages. So the Cumbrian White-Tailed Eagle Steering Group are leading the social feasibility study, and Lifescape are one of the 9 organisations that are involved. So this evening, we have a presentation on white-tailed sea eagle reintroduction to Ireland, delivered by Allan Mee. So Dr Allan Mee is an experienced ornithologist with almost 40 years professional experience in conservation and is a raptor specialist. So has been working with the white-tailed sea eagles in Ireland from 2007. So we'll have this presentation and then a Q&A session afterwards. So before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. So there is a Q&A section. If you could just pop any questions that you have that you'd like to ask Allan at the end in there, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A there. So I think I will now hand over to you, Allan.
Yeah, okay. So sorry about that. Yeah, so title of the talk, Reintroduction to Ireland. So the project, as Faye mentioned, has been ongoing since 2007. And it's a collaboration between an EANGO, the Golden Eagle Trust, during the first phase of reintroductions, National Parks and Wildlife Service, which is the statutory nature conservation organisation in the Republic of Ireland, and NINA, that's the Norwegian Institute of Nature Research in Norway, our Norwegian partners. So a brief history of species extinction. I may be old, but I wasn't around in 1500. But yeah, so this data is based on a paper published in Bird Study in 2012 by Evans et al. So I'm sure you're well aware of showing the distribution of white-tailed eagles and golden eagles in Britain and Ireland. So you can see the both species were really widely distributed at that time. So this is largely based on historical place names. So you've got white-tailed eagles in blue and golden eagles in red. Again, this is probably an underestimated, but the population was estimated at that time, this is for Britain and Ireland, to be something in the region of 800 to 1,400 pairs. So it was obviously a pretty widespread bird. So in the Irish context, its extinction, it was obviously declining throughout the 17th and 18th century, and by the 19th century, it was really down to a handful of fairly isolated and remote parts of the island of Ireland. So these are some of the last extinction dates for white-tailed eagles in Ireland. So you've got Hornhead up in Donegal in the late 19th century, Achill in Mayo on the west, the Mourne Mountains in Northern Ireland, 1831, Connemara in the west of Ireland, sometime after 1841, Lochbray and Wicklow, Blasket Islands, remote island off the southwest coast around the 1880s, the Cumbria Mountains, 1864, the Beara Peninsula in 1894. And the last stand for white-tailed eagles in Ireland was a site, a remote site in the northwest coast of Ireland in County Mayo. You'll see the blue arrow pointing to it on the island of Ireland. All those little dots are sites that I put on from known sites in Ireland that still exist on OS maps today. But just to read this little excerpt really from a book published in some years back, it said the species bred here successfully for at least 6 years up to 1909. The nest had been robbed previously at a nearby site. This site was presumably last in Mayo to hold breeding sea eagles, and that was in 1909. Birds did turn up in Ireland after those dates, but no breeding after this, sadly. Another species declines to extinction. And Ireland, unfortunately, has a really bad history as far as raptor persecution is concerned. One of at least 7 raptor species that were lost, including golden eagles, goshawks, ospreys, red kite, common buzzard, and marsh harrier, mainly due to human persecution. And you can see from the pictures at the bottom left, the similar to Britain, really, the main causes of extinction of our large raptors were collecting, shooting, and poisoning. And just to read that little excerpt on the right-hand side from a book published on the natural history of Ireland, gamekeepers were with guns and poison decided the fate of eagles in Ireland, and the partiality of this species, that's the sea eagle, for carrion precluded any hope of its survival. But in the late 19th century, we've seen a recovery and recolonization of raptor populations, which has been a really kind of a bright light really in what could be a fairly depressing scene of biodiversity decline. So golden eagles and red kites reintroduced, as well as white-tailed eagles, common buzzard, northern goshawk re-establishing, marsh harrier and osprey, I had to say, may recolonize as well. We know ospreys have started to breed in the Republic of Ireland the last 2 years and are being reintroduced as we speak. So reintroduction is a conservation tool in species restoration. Reintroduction is defined as the intentional movement and release of an organism inside its indigenous range from which it has disappeared. So key considerations for any reintroduction and clearly will be the case in Cumbria as well is the reintroduction justified? What are the costs and benefits of reintroduction? The causes of extinction, have they been addressed? Planning, goals and objectives, feasibility and design, release site selection and area reporting, and measuring success and failure. When is the population secure? And I was lucky enough to, before my time on white-tailed eagles in Ireland, to spend 5 years working on this bird. In the top left, you have the California condor, the largest flying bird in North America. The last birds were trapped into captivity in 1987. The population at that time in the 80s was down to 22 known birds, critically endangered. The last bird trapped into captivity, and the reintroduction has been ongoing since the 90s now. I was there 20 years ago for 5 years. So the population is slowly increasing, but ongoing threats like lead poisoning. Near to home, you have the bearded vulture on the middle left there. Successful reintroductions throughout Europe, the Alps, Pyrenees, places like this. And another species that I had a little bit of involvement was this parrot on the bottom left, one of the only 2 parrots that was native to the United States, besides the Carolina parakeet, became extinct in the early 20th century. This is the thick-billed parrot, found nowadays only in Mexico, very endangered, but it was reintroduced into Arizona in the United States, but unfortunately that the reintroduction failed. Top right, you'll see the guidelines for reintroductions for conservation translocations, which is I suppose a starting point really for any reintroduction. White-tailed eagles found throughout the Western Palearctic, really from Siberia, from Greenland across the west to Greenland, and populations in Iceland as well. So very widespread along in the northern hemisphere. Range overlaps with another Haliaetus eagle, the Stellar sea eagle, in the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia and in northern Japan. So if you think white-tailed eagles are big, certainly this is a stunning looking bird. someday, hopefully on my bucket list to see, but haven't seen it yet. White-tailed eagles have been successfully reintroduced to the Western Scotland, 1975 to 85, the first phase of reintroductions, second phase in 1992 to 96 in Eastern Scotland from 2007 on, ongoing reintroduction in the Southern England, and now over 130 breeding pairs in Scotland. And also a reintroduction going on in Spain actually at the moment. So our founder population was from Norway, and these have been the founder populations really for birds in Scotland as well. World population estimated at maybe 25 to 50,000 adult birds, with maybe 9 to 12,500 pairs in Europe. But these are pretty much guesstimates rather than accurate estimates. It's a very large bird eagle with a similar ecology to bald eagles, 2.4-meter wingspan, primarily fish eating, and young and immatures, unlike golden eagles, can be very, very social. Stunning looking bird, obviously, is an adult with that pale head and white tail. White-tailed eagles as top predators are bioindicators of the presence of environmental pollutants, and excellent sentinels of ecosystem health. And raptors in general are excellent bioindicators, and one of the classic studies on this was the discovery of the impacts of DDT on peregrine falcons by scientists such as Derek Ratcliffe. But DDT was an organic chlorine pesticide that was in use after the Second World War in Britain and Ireland and throughout Europe, and had drastic impacts on raptors, including white-tailed eagles. So you can see the top left, you'll see a white-tailed eagle chick with an unhatched egg, and this was the case for a lot of raptors. The toxins really bioaccumulated in the bird, causing eggshell thinning. The eggs broke or didn't hatch. So you can see on the graph here, you can see by the early 70s, the situation was pretty dire for white-tailed eagles. You can see on the right, mean productivity was very, very low. It just weren't producing chicks to fledging. They weren't hatching eggs. With the banning of DDT in the 70s, the population started to recover. Maybe it took really into the 90s before the population really recovered. But organic chlorines and other heavy metals like mercury, this is a study from just last year from Croatia, showing the impacts of heavy metals or the presence of heavy metals in tissues of white-tailed eagles in Croatia. So our founder populations mentioned some Norway, a big population of up to 3,000 pairs, good productivity, stable or increasing population trends, and a long history of population monitoring. A beautiful landscape as well. A lot of extensive forests, islands and skerries that birds breed on. Some of these little skerries and offshore islands don't have any ground predators, so birds like white-tailed eagles will nest on the ground where there are no trees, which made it quite easy to collect birds under license for transport to Ireland. But the stunning landscape, lots of fjords with white-tailed eagles breeding, in densities, usually around maybe one white-tailed eagle pair to every 10 kilometers of shoreline on average. So we targeted nests that were fairly accessible. They obviously had to have 2 chicks under license, so we would leave 1 chick, take 1 for Ireland, try and determine the sex at the time, and use very high-tech methods for transporting birds back to our vehicles, where they were transported a holding cage before being shipped out to Ireland. And we did all health checks and sexing of the birds before they were transported to Ireland. White-tailed eagles were held for some 5 to 8 weeks in flight pens in Ireland. So you can see the button on that map on the left. You can see the little green dot is Killarney National Park in the southwest of Ireland, where the birds were transported to. And this site was selected really, because it was a very secure location. It was a former breeding site for white-tailed eagles, and birds were housed in a remote location, fed mainly fish, crows, and venison. So this is looking across Killarney National Park. Looks not at all dissimilar to parts of the Lake District, really. And is this area of County Kerry in the southwest is a mecca for tourists as well. So quite, busy in the summer with tourism. Very similar, I would say, to the Lake District. Obviously, we don't have major populations like Manchester and Liverpool on our doorstep, but still, it's not really a remote location. Birds are isolated in flight pens, so to minimize human contact before release. And before release, we attached VHF tags to the birds in those first 5 years in 2007 to 2011, and solar GPS tags to some of the birds in those early days where we could afford to put them on, and now we're putting on GPS solar tags to pretty much all the birds who are released. And obviously you can see the size of those talons, quite important to be careful when you're doing this work. And all this work was done under licenses from the BTO using standard methods with fitting backpacks. So this is white-tailed, just showed. So when the birds were released into the wild, we provided supplementary food for up to 3 months post-release. Mainly deer carcasses, which were left out on the shoreline of the lake. And this is a site maybe 6 kilometers from the release site. You maybe hear ravens calling. I don't know if you can hear that. You got hooded crows. So you can see the size of juvenile white-tailed eagle compared to hooded crows. You can also see the VHF backpack on its back with the antenna sticking out. So, but yeah, so birds were fed for a couple of months until food was phased out and we dispersed. And some birds dispersed without feeding at all. All birds are wing tagged, as I mentioned, and eagle dispersal, like other long-lived raptors with deferred maturation, can be split into the juvenile dispersal phase of the first year. So you've got this, you can see in the graph here, you've got this post-fledging dependence when birds are, food is still provided by the food in the natural situation. Here, of course, we were doing this by providing carcasses. The birds would disperse over the next few months, usually over the winter, early winter, and then spend a couple of years exploring pretty much the whole country before returning back towards their natal areas to settle or finding an area to settle. And this is during the settlement phase. And you can see on the left, you can see wing tags would be used to identify the birds in flight. We've now phased out wing tags, so all the chicks these days, Irish bred chicks, are color ringed rather than wing tagged. So during phase 1 of the reintroduction, satellite tagged females tended to disperse further than males. You can see in this graph, the red line being the females and blue being males. So both tend to disperse away and then return near the natal area after about 3 years. So this was the typical pattern, although most birds and raptors, female bisnatal dispersal is the observed pattern. White-tailed eagles dispersed over much of Ireland. I'm just going to show you a little animation here. A white-tailed eagle dispersed over much of Ireland the 2nd and 3rd calendar years, including at least 11 birds to Scotland, including this bird, which all the way to the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland. Spent pretty much about 9 months away from Ireland before returning back to its back to Killarney and actually 3 years later, after it was paired up with another a male down in the southwest of Ireland. And Ireland and Britain are potentially one biogeographic unit for white-tailed eagles, but relatively few birds make the short crossing from Northern Ireland to Scotland, which is about 20 kilometers, or some birds island hop from Antrim to Rathlin Island to Islay and up the islands towards the Isle of Mull. And we've only had one birds make this crossing across towards Galloway. And birds tend to the departure lounge before cancelling their trip, the birds that don't make it. But one bird did do that. I'm just going to play this animation while I'm talking. So one bird broke the golden rule of Celtic brother and sisterhood by visiting England in 2019. Also visited the Isle of Man, the first white-tailed eagle on the Isle of Man since 1930. And this is an Irish bred male that's been to summer in Northumberland. And you can see the photo on the right there is a landscape very different from the west of Ireland. You can see mostly driven grouse moor. And the bird this bird Angus returned to northwest of Ireland, is now resident and breeding there. But there's also been no movement really of Scottish birds to Ireland. It's largely been one way. It's by the third and fourth calendar year, birds are establishing territories at potential breeding sites. So you can see breeding sites on the map there, mostly in the southwest, but also in the northwest. And birds tended to settle, most birds tend to settle less than 50 kilometers from their natal or release site, with a smaller cohort of birds, maybe 120 to 200 kilometers away. And those are these birds up here. And males tended to return closer than females of the birds that we know that are breeding. Home ranges in the wild in Norway and in Germany vary depending on territory quality, especially food and nest sites are important. In Norway, home range size estimated 6 to 9 square kilometers, and Germany taking quite small home ranges from 2.5 to 12 kilometers. This one in Ireland, satellite tag female, has a pretty big home range during the year, outside the breeding season, up to 90 square kilometers. But during the breeding season, it can be really as small as 3 square kilometers when they're largely confined to when they're providing food for young or sitting on eggs. And a male on the right hand side, you can see its breeding range outside of the outside during the non-breeding season up to 128 kilometers square, but during the breeding season much smaller. Sorry about that, just gone backwards. Oops, press the wrong key, bear with me. So it's range during the breeding season. What type of trees do birds use for nesting, and how far do they nest on water? So it's largely been about 2/3 of the birds have been nesting in conifers, such as especially Scots pine, are heavily favoured. Unfortunately, sickle spruce can often be the only tree in some of these areas, like in the northwest and Donegal, but they've also nested Monterey pine and even got one in sequoia. Broadleaf trees such as ash, oak, especially oak, with this tree on the bottom left, and distance from water bodies can vary from 5 meters to right on the water's edge to up to 7 kilometers at a site that's a marine site. And most of ours, about 60% of ours, have been inland sites at freshwater bodies. So you can see some of the nests here. And the question I guess we can start answer now is, are marine or freshwater sites more productive? I'm going to play this little video while I talk to you. So that's the bottom left is a pair that are nesting. We had nesting at a nest cam on the nest in Glengariff, a marine site. So to date, really, most of our most productive sites have been on freshwater sites, especially a couple of pairs that are nesting on one lake, which have fledged. You know, 50 of our 64 chicks fledged to date have been from freshwater sites, and the productivity has been higher there, a number of fledged young per nesting pairs. And distance of water might be important at those sites. Nesting close to water could be important. Obviously, spending less time flying out to find prey. But other factors such as experience and habitat quality are going to be important. You can see the video showed the juvenile on the nest, just displacing an adult that had brought in food and doing a typical guarding the prey. As I mentioned, some sites are more successful than others, like freshwater sites. So 42% of all our young have come from this one lake in the centre of Ireland, Lochderg. So marine sites have been less productive, but birds have started to spread now into the northwest of Ireland. And this year, our first breeding pair in County Fermanagh in northwest Ireland. And as time has gone on, the productivity of the birds and nesting success has increased. So here you can see the number of fledged young in number of territories in blue, and the number of nesting pairs in orange, number of fledged young in green. So we had our first fledged young in 2013. We had increasing up to about 2017. 2018, our best pairs were really hit by avian influenza, which I'll touch on briefly, and we really had a few years where birds were unpaired, and then we had other birds joining, recruiting into the population, and the population recovering over time. So this year was our best year to date, with 13 chicks fledged in the wild. It's a slow process, obviously, and mortality such as avian influenza can slow population growth. Re-establishment is threatened mainly by anthropogenic factors such as poisoning. Late spring storms have been severely impacted breeding success in some years, and annual survivorship in year 1, year 2 to 4, and year 5 is really obviously impacted by mortality, and poisoning impacts all those years regardless of age, and losing adult birds can really set back your population. So that has been something we've been trying to address, which I'm just going to touch on now. Also, avian influenza, as I mentioned, which I'll come back to shortly. So you can see the poisoning on the graph on the right has really, these are known causes of death. Poisoning has been an important factor. Also, turbine strikes at wind farms, 14%, avian influenza, 11%. We've had some birds that unfortunately have been shot, but hasn't been a huge issue. Poisoning was banned in 2010, really as a result of the light that was shone on illegal poisoning by the recovery of dead white-tailed eagles. Ireland was one of only 2 countries in the EU that had a derogation that allowed it to continue to use poisons, mainly to control foxes and crows and upland sheep farms. So poisoning was banned in 2010, but the turnover in adult breeding population, with the loss of some adults, disrupting breeding success and population stability, was a real issue. And you can see the birds that were recovered and those that were poisoned in orange there on the graph. Also, mortality at wind turbine sites. The site on the bottom left, the smaller wind farm, one of the biggest concentration of breeding white-tailed eagles, with a wind farm that was sited on top of it, probably a worst case scenario for white-tailed eagles, over 100 birds killed at that site. And we've had issues with 5 birds killed. This was monitoring that was done at the wind farm site in Ireland, showing flight lines of white-tailed eagles. And unfortunately, this is what you can recover when you find birds. So it is an issue. Hasn't been an issue uh, as severe as poisoning, but it's certainly one to really important that you cite your release location at sites that are remote from wind farms, and obviously the siting wind farms in future as well. Should really be informed by where white-tailed eagles are breeding. As I mentioned, avian influenza has been an increasing threat, led to the loss of 2 of our most productive females. It really knocked us back in 2018, resulting in a crash in the number of young fledged and the loss of 3 to 5 breeding seasons for widowed males at those sites. Happily, both those males are now repaired, and you can see from this here how this is a graphic just showing how avian influenza can spread. It originated in poultry farms in Asia, spread as birds migrated into Europe, generally waterfowl, brought it into Europe, into Britain and Ireland. And obviously you've seen the effects much closer to home, such as barnacle geese. There were mass mortality in the island of Islay, and then also on the Solway Firth, with I think something like 13,000 birds, a third of Svalbard population of geese killed in Solway Firth, which in Galloway. So what reasons for success and failure? Key learnings. Restoring a top avian predator scavenger requires long-term commitment and re-establishment. It's threatened mainly by anthropogenic factors such as poisoning, but new threats may arise to impact population viability. The number of released population, you need to release a critical mass. Also, post-release monitoring and recovery of birds is obviously critical, addressing to address and minimize threats for re-establishment and viability, and legislation, obviously, to enforce wildlife legislation. And you need an adaptive and creative response to eagle population recovery, such as the use of public sites. Down the bottom left, this was a site of our first breeding in white-tailed eagles in Ireland. We went public with, because as you can see from the two kids that are monitoring the eagle nest on that island, it was right in front of a little village on Lough Derg in County Clare in the Midwest in Ireland. So it was also important to address perceptions and misconceptions regarding the threat of eagles to livestock. This was a little cartoon that appeared around the time when birds were first released in Ireland. So we had to address all those, and especially at those sites where white-tailed eagles started to breed and then become public, to engage with the local communities. So the local communities took ownership of the project, and also the farming community. We could allay their fears somewhat. It took time, but you can see in the headlines that I just pulled out today, and just put those on. This is on the top here from the Farmers Journal, which is the farmers' newspaper of choice in Ireland, really, and goes to pretty much all the farming community in Ireland. So here they are advertising where to see white-tailed eagles in Ireland, which is always nice. And then the local paper on the left, visitors flock to eagles viewing platform. And we know from the Isle of Mull how important seagull tourism is to generating funds for the island. Said to account for something like 5 to 8 million in spending on the island of Mull, which is a population of only 2,800 people, and supporting something like 100 to 160 full-time jobs on the island. So white-tailed eagles not kind of really benefits us obviously from to local communities, not just because the birds deserve to be there, but they can bring tangible benefits in the form of, sustainable and green jobs. But talking about addressing farming, the farming worries, obviously the threat to lambs was a real worry for farmers, and we had protests when the birds first came to Ireland. So it took a lot of time and effort to engage with farmers to maybe turn it around. And this is from 2018 on the left, from protests, the partnerships, how farmers are supporting the reintroduction of white-tailed seagulls in Ireland. And this is a recent, this year, white-tailed eagles win over farmers thanks to the successful return. So it took time, but I'm sure it could be done. If it can be done in Ireland, it can be done in Cumbria. And now we're on the successful second phase of the reintroduction in Ireland since 2020, releasing birds. 97 birds have been released from 5 different sites across Ireland. And all 3 of those birds from the first cohort in 2020 have already been recruited into the breeding population in Ireland. So the sites here, released sites, were number 1, number 4 in Killarney, 5 on the Shannon Estuary, 10 on Loch Corrib in Galway. And you can see some of this is a graphic really of our satellite tracked birds. So you can see they're still largely West Coast birds. So they're using much of the island, but you can see how the Shannon system on the center of Ireland and the West Coast are the preferred habitat really as they spread. And just about to finish up, white-tailed eagles rarely produce 3 chicks in the wild, but we've now had 1 female that started to breed in 2010. This was a female at the site on this Loch Derg, on that lake, and she's in 5 years she's fledged 3 sets of triplets and 2 doubles. So incredible productivity, and this is a site that's largely driven by the fish population. It's very, very productive. Trios are quite rare, only up to 5% in the Swedish Baltic, and 0 of 83 broods in Lapland. So to see that in Ireland is really, really encouraging, and maybe points us to maybe we should have thought about and we are thinking about that now as far in the second release about where to release birds. We released them in Killarney National Park, but maybe we're finding some of these areas which are much more productive should be the mainstay of the population where they're going to be released. And finally, just to say that the reintroduction really it's not only a long-term project and requires long-term commitment, but it's a multi-agency project, as I'm sure it will be in Cumbria as well, between statutory agencies, National Parks and Wildlife Service, Golden Eagle Trust, NINA in Norway, and involving a lot of people from climbers to farmers who monitor the nests, to people who flew the eagles back from Norway, various carriers and various conservation rangers that have helped me over the years tag birds and find nests. And so without that, it just wouldn't have been possible for the reintroduction to get to where it is today. And hopefully it's we are getting there, and it's not viable yet, but I think we're hopefully we'll reach that point in the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much, Alan, for that. It was really informative, and it's clear how much dedication and experience has gone into this. So there has been lots of questions. So I'll start with the first one. So the first one asks, why might reintroductions fail? What are the main key factors that might result in a project failure?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on where the birds are released. Like each country or every site probably has its own peculiarities, but I would say poisoning for us was the biggest factor by far. If we took poisoning out of the equation, we would probably be reaching the stage where the population would be viable now. We probably even wouldn't needed a second release of birds. But it has been an ongoing issue. We seem to have solved it for quite a while. Up to we didn't have any poisonings after 2015. The number had gone down after poisons were banned in 2010, but they've crept up again. You might have heard of two birds that were picked up dead, poisoned in Antrim in Northern Ireland there a couple of years ago, and getting prosecutions has also been quite problematic. So I think probably wherever you are in Britain and Ireland, if you can address and solve the poisoning issue, you will go a long way to solving any issues regarding getting the viability, but also obviously addressing fears from local people, especially in those before birds are released and in those initial stages, addressing those fears really. But the poisoning one was the big one for us.
That's really interesting. Why do you think that it's picked up in recent years with poisonings?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Why? Because maybe we're lulled into a bit of a false sense of security that maybe we cracked it, it all gone away. Um, but we kind of suspected there was something going, because not all we don't recover all birds that die. Not every bird is satellite tagged, so we're going to lose some birds maybe. But and there seemed to be a concentration of poisonings in parts of Ireland. So those birds are now finding those areas, and maybe some of the new birds are finding expanding into those areas, and that's why we're really picking it up. But we had that in the early days in Kerry, and that was probably also maybe a little bit of an artifact of where the birds were released. That it became, we were picking up most of the birds there because they were released there and coming back there to breed. But now we're finding it and having to address it in some of those other areas. So hopefully we can address it,
Mm.
and it doesn't become a major issue for us going forward.
Thank you for that, Alan. So our next question asks, how does your experience of the process of reintroducing a species in America compare with your experience doing this in Ireland?
Yeah, it's quite different in lots of ways, and but also striking similarities. The condor was a massive, uh, heavily funded state project funded by the Department of the Interior, the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there were millions and millions being pumped into the and still are into the Condor project. It's now expanded. There are a number of players like ENGOs, the Peregrine Fund, Ventana Wilderness Society that are involved. So it's a big conservation project. But the similarities, whereas in Ireland, it was a very small team. But I suppose the similarities when all reintroductions really are some of the mortality factors. The big problems for condors are still anthropogenic, mainly lead poisoning. And that's been the ongoing issue since the birds were first trapped into captivity. It was the major factor in the decline, and it's still being addressed today in the US. It's obviously very, very difficult with the gun control legislation in the US. To sort to sort the lead problem out. But for white illegals in Europe and Britain and Ireland, those same realities and those same issues crop up. So they're not that dissimilar.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, you'd think there would be a lot of differences. But yeah, this kind of leads on to the next question. So do we know the impact of PFAs, their impact and long-term maybe impact of PFAs is on these birds?
PFAs, I'm not sure what do you mean by PFAs?
So forever chemicals?
Right, okay. Yeah, I'm not actually I hadn't heard of that term. I've heard of POPs or whatever you call them, persistent organic pollutants
Mm,
and various heavy metals. Um, as I mentioned there on one of those slides, how the impact of DDT on white-tailed eagles and other raptors, um, that's that's been addressed. But then there are ongoing issues, certainly in the Baltic, I believe, with PCBs and other pollutants are still an issue. Lead, obviously, is heavy metal is still an issue for birds, but that's mainly ingested to hunter shot game is the big issue for white-tailed eagles in countries like Germany, where lead is still problematic. But in the marine environment, where they're picking it up, where they're at the top of the food chain, they're feeding on mainly on fish, but also water birds. Then they're picking up and bioaccumulating these issues. So it is still an issue, but we don't know if it's an issue. It's not showing up with
mm,
us in Ireland as far as we've been. We don't have really any hatching success issues. They're producing. So it does seem to be the issue with producing chicks in Ireland is mainly a food issue, getting enough food to some of those sites. They're producing lots of chicks in some of those sites where there's lots of food, but not in all those. So that's our major issue really as far as productivity is concerned.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So the next question says, do the wing tags and tracking harnesses interfere with the eagle's flight at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I did mention ethical considerations there on that slide where we were attaching tags. And like it has been shown in some species that that backpacks and various devices attached to birds can be problematic for some species, but it doesn't seem to be any issue for eagles. There is no any studies there is no survivorship differences or differences in breeding success between birds that are tagged or not tagged. Um, wing tags have been really useful for us in tracking birds that don't have working transmitters. We can identify the birds from a kilometer, sometimes a couple of kilometers away with these wing tags. But over time, we've decided to phase those out, and because they do fall off over time.
Mm.
Whereas the colorings, you might have seen the coloring on that chick, they stay on for life and are much less intrusive. So we've moved to colorings as they have in Britain now as well for marking white-tailed eagles.
Okay, yeah, no, that's interesting to know, and I suppose, yeah, an important consideration. So I'm a little bit worried that this is just going to cut me out in a minute's time, but I'm going to try
Yeah,
and ask one more question. So apologies if it does kick us out.
no worries. Yeah,
Um,
sorry, we were late getting started, so I
yeah.
understand.
No, it's okay. I don't think it should because it's Teams, but let's see. Um, so the next question, I think we've got time for a couple more. So is it financially viable to spend conservation money on reintroducing species when so many species in the same environment are suffering from population decline? Would reintroducing a new species detract funding from other species that are already in Cumbria?
Yeah, I probably can't answer the situation in Cumbria But in Ireland, we had those very, very same questions before birds were released, because we still have, probably as in Britain, we have a lot of threatened birds, a lot of birds on the red list, who are all, um, equally or valid targets for conservation action and funding. Species like corncrake, which have been, on decline for years, and now making through conservation action are making a recovery. But we've, you know, as in Britain, we have a lot of birds on a red list, which are all deserving of funding. But I don't think it certainly wasn't for us. It wasn't an either or situation. The money we largely used for white-tailed eagle funding didn't come from the same pot of money that would have gone to for those red listed birds. So we tried to raise money privately, and we also sourced money from areas that weren't taking from those species. But we had those same questions, and I think I'm sure you could the same should apply to Cumbria as well.
Yeah, I think they're quite common questions when it comes to species reintroductions. But yeah, I think the money system, it's yeah, is quite structured in a different way. So we have time for one more question. So I understand there has been no land predation in Ireland, unlike the problems in West Scotland. Have you any theory as to why this should be?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Um, there's probably a few different things going on here. Like we did have lamb issues in the early days of the birds as they spread out, but it was, I think, largely a question of perception. So, farmers weren't used to seeing white-tailed eagles sitting in the middle of a field where there are lambs or sheep. And obviously, before the birds came out, they were well aware that um, of white-tailed eagle. There was a protest at the airport, as I mentioned. So there was some misconceptions regarding white-tailed eagles, and we had to address those. And it was really important to actually be there and meet the farmers and address them at the time. Um, in large part, we found that the farmers themselves found that where white-tailed eagles were showing up in lambing areas, it was for stillborn lambs. Um, but we really had to address those. We formed a committee. We were actually going down the route of, do we need to pay farmers or compensate farmers for losses? But it never actually arose, and we decided to, and over time we've had. In the last maybe 10 years, we've had maybe a couple of cases which had to be addressed again. And like one case turned out to be dog predation of adult sheep. Clearly wasn't a white-tailed eagle, a case of white-tailed eagle predation. Why it's different in Scotland, it's hard to be absolutely sure, but from the studies that have been done, the scientific studies that were done on Mull, looking at diet at eagle nests, and also in one case putting on transmitters on lambs up in Wester Ross, where they were believed to a couple of pairs of white-tailed eagles were believed to be impacting on lambs there, showed that when you do the science, that rather than actually depend on just anecdotal evidence, the impacts were very, very low. 1 to 2% of lamb predation was down to maybe assigned to predation. There was predation going on on the Mull, but compared to 10, maybe 15% of losses to natural mortality, it was still pretty low. And it could be the fact that a lot of those losses to predation were of weak lambs that would have been lost in the first couple of weeks of life due to weather and things like that. Anyway, but why it's become such an issue throughout Scotland, it's hard to really put a finger on it. But all I can say is that we haven't had it in Ireland. Um, it, it, it's just in the Cumbria situation, it would just have to be addressed. You've got to engage with farmers, bring them on board, and really, in an ideal scenario, have a farmer there as one of your voices for white-tailed eagles and in Cumbria, and that will go a long way to changing hearts and minds.
Thank you, Alan. That was yeah, really insightful, and yeah, it's so every context is so different. So yeah, very difficult to say. So again, we'd just like to thank you for your time and answering those questions. I know there's a lot more, but
You're welcome.
thank you. We
Sorry,
can maybe
sorry to get you
collate.
at the start.
Yeah, no, apologies. Technology and me have not been getting on this month. There's a few more questions, but we can put that in a document and maybe answer them another
Yep.
time. So this session's been recorded and we'll pop it on our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. And for all those that haven't completed our questionnaire for the Cumbrian White-Tailed Eagle Project, that is on the Lifescape Project website. We've also got a few more drop-in events coming up. So the next one is on the 12th of November, so next week, in Ulverston. So yeah, it'd be great if some of you can pop by and we can meet you in person. But yeah, once again, Alan, thank you so much. It's been really interesting and a really interesting presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Faye. Take care and best wishes.
Thank you. Have a good
Cheers.
evening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.